I'm excited to share with you guys. We're starting a new series called Shining Star, and we're going to be looking at the Book of Esther, which is really an incredible book. And I think you're going to discover that as we dive into this text more and more. And today, I just want to start it off just by discovering more about Esther. So I just want to let you know some things about it. I'm not going to go through everything, but there's some really cool things. Like, it's amazing the rich story that Esther brings. It seems to have this complexity and beauty throughout the text, and even with the text's origin. So most scholars will say that there's 4 important witnesses to the story of Esther in different languages. So there's the Hebrew Masoretic text, and there's 3 Greek versions. They all kind of tell the same story, but they might have other bits added in. So there's some of the Greek versions where it adds in a prayer from Esther, or a prayer from Mordecai, who are 2 main characters in this book. Or there's a decree that's made that almost leads to a mass genocide of the Jews. They have that written decree written out in one of the versions. So it's just little things like that, but I think it's important to point that kind of stuff out, because it can show us the richness of this story. It can show us some of the complexity that happened to make these sacred texts really come together. Another thing that I think is really cool is the Book of Esther emerged between the late 5th century and the first half of the 4th century BC. And that's an estimated time band. You might have a different time band for it. Some scholars might have a different one, but somewhere within that gap, most people say this story emerged. So this sacred text has a rich history, and it has complexity and beauty with even how it was put together. And it's also important to know with this story, it's a bit interesting when we dive into it because it doesn't seem to have one clear genre. It seems to bounce around with the kind of genre that it might be. And I think it's important to know that because Esther is a text in which the cross-fertilization of various genres should be appreciated. Because I think these cross-fertilizations, that's a hard word to say. Don't worry, that probably won't be the only one I mess up on, Kim. You can help me later practice with my speaking. But cross-fertilization, we need to appreciate that because it makes the story come alive. That's why Esther, when you read it, it's a bit more captivating than some of the other books. So we don't need to try to pin it down. We just need to embrace it, appreciate it for what it is. And then another thing that's really cool is there's a theme of reversal that's ingrained into the structure of Esther. And I forgot to take "is" out. I knew I forgot something. But I love this theme of reversal that's just ingrained throughout the whole story. And these reversals occur because actions of powerful people are overturned by similar actions from a different power source. Now, Esther never says clearly what this different power source is. And that's because the author works tirelessly to keep God's name from ever being mentioned. And he avoids religious language. And it's crazy, too, when you actually read it. It would have been easier sometimes for him to just say God. Like, he seems to go out of his way to not include God by name. He seems to go out of his way to not include religious language. Again and again, he chooses the harder path. The author throughout the story seems to be saying to us, I'm inviting you to hear this story and to respond to it with faith. This journey to faith requires pondering the events, searching for God within the plot, and choosing to see his active presence. I think that's a beautiful quote from an Old Testament commentary on Esther by Deborah Reed, not Deborah Bird. But with all these amazing things about Esther, today I really want to focus on one as we look at the first 3 chapters. And the thing I want to focus on is moral ambiguity. I got it right. Good practice, see? See, I knew it was good to practice that word this week. It's a tricky word. Try saying ambiguity. What? Don't laugh at me. It's true. It's a hard word. But I want to look at that. Because that's something that we see throughout this book. And if you don't know what this word means, it means a lack of certainty about whether something is right or wrong. Now, I'm not talking about the simple right and wrongs that we might know of as a kid. I'm talking about as we get older and life is more complex, and it's a little bit harder to know what's right and wrong. I mean, Ukraine's a perfect example. It's a little bit hard to know what's right and wrong to do in that situation. You have leaders struggling with what to do. I mean, what do we do as Christians? Jesus tells us pretty clearly to love your enemy. So what does that mean for Ukraine Christians in Ukraine? Are they meant not to protect their home? Is it that simple, or is it more complex? That's what moral ambiguity is. It's that complexity. And Esther makes us wrestle with this. Because there's a lot of drinking. There's a lot of adult cuddles. I thought that was a better word to use, adult cuddles. You know, the adults know what I mean by that. But yeah, there's a lot of adult cuddles. There's a lot of violation of the Torah commandments throughout this book. And I think as kids, we avoid this wrestle, which I think is a good thing. As a kid, you don't need to know all the ins and outs. I feel like if someone would have talked to me like this when I was a kid, I probably would have sounded them out like 5 minutes in. And they would have started looking like, is Charlie Brown a thing here? Yeah, you know how whenever the parents talked, it's mom, 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 mom. I feel like it would have been like that. But we're not kids anymore. We're adults. Or when we start to mature in our faith, we have to wrestle with the fact that Esther is full of moral ambiguity. Which makes me ask, firstly, what do we do with this? Do we continue to deny it? Or act like it isn't there and come up with surface value answers that won't hold up when life's complexity is thrown at us? I mean, what does this say about black and white thinking? This simplistic idea of everything's just so black and white, it's easy to know what's right and wrong. Because this book shows us something different. And I don't think we can keep avoiding reflecting on it or sitting with it or trying to figure out what to do. And it's been hard for me to try to think of how to condense 3 chapters. My first idea was like, I'll just stand here and read the whole 3 chapters. And then I kind of read the 3 chapters on my own, and I'm like, that took a little bit. So I didn't know if that would be too long of a message. So what I want to do is I want to do these fly-throughs. So I just want to fly through each chapter, point out a couple things, maybe read some scriptures, and just keep going through this text. So let's start off by flying through chapter 1. So chapter 1, you have King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew version. It might say that. They're both the same thing. And we find out he's powerful. Like, really powerful. Like, all the story seems to add up to it. The way they talk about Susa, the capital where most of this story takes place, is talked about in a way where it's just showing you how powerful this king is. And then, you know, because he's a powerful king, and it's what they did back then, King Xerxes and Queen Vashti throw a massive banquet and party. Like, elaborate. Like, this goes on for days. Like, you should read about it. It must have been a blast. Like, you know, free food, free drinks. I would have definitely been there. But one thing that happens is King Xerxes wants to show off Queen Vashti, which you can find out through the story he kind of views as his property. And he wants to show her off to his friends. And this is an interesting part of the story, and I want to read it to you now. And we find it in Esther chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, and I'm reading from the NIV version. It says this: on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine. I love that, high in spirits from wine. That's such an elegant way to say that. Let's keep going, though. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mumen, Bitsta, Habana, Bigtha, Abagatha, Zethar, and Carcass. I've practiced in the mirror a lot this week, guys. All right. To bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. I want to pause here for a moment, because this is why a lot of people think that she was meant to be naked, because he only wants her royal crown on. Now, you can wear your royal crown without anything else. So this is why lots of scholars are like, all right, he's and you know, this story kind of, she's lovely to look at. He wants to show her off. Like, look, guys, look at my queen. And he's probably not in the best frame of mind, because his spirits are pretty high on wine, we've already found out. But let's see what Queen Vashti does. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. I mean, wow. Talk about a woman standing up for herself, knowing her worth. We kind of see that with Queen Vashti in the beginning. I kind of love how it says King Xerxes is burning with anger. The reason he's burning with anger is it's unlawful to refuse or force a visit with the king for anyone, even the queen. Which leads to King Xerxes getting advice from Memucan and others who inform him of the significance of the law being broken by Queen Vashti. They tell him, look, you got to watch it, like she's a powerful woman. If words get out, then our wives might disrespect us. Our wives might not respect us. They try to make this big scene. And we find out throughout this story, King Xerxes seems to take advice from the people around him in his inner circle very easily throughout. So this leads King Xerxes to make a decree. He decrees for Queen Vashti to be banished and stripped of her title, and that all women respect their husbands. And this is the last that we hear of Queen Vashti. Some people assume that her banishment led to her execution. We don't know for sure. The story doesn't make that out clearly. But this is the last that we see of her. Someone just got exiled for standing up saying, hey, I'm not going to come with just my royal crown. Like, you're a little bit too high in spirits when you're on wine. Like that's what she did, and she's banished. She's punished for it. Let's keep going, and let's see what happens in chapter 2. And chapter 2 begins with King Xerxes. After a little bit, he misses Queen Vashti. So after being advised again, he orders for beautiful young women to be brought to him. He will then choose the one who pleases him to be queen. Women picked for this process were forced to wait on the king as well, to be called on. And if they went once, they had to wait till they were called on again. They weren't allowed to leave. And with being called on, there was a lot of prep you can read about. There's lots of perfume and lots of stuff that they would put on these women. After we read about this decree to get all the beautiful young virgin women brought to King Xerxes, we get introduced to Esther and Mordecai. And then Esther is taken to King Xerxes. We find out that Esther doesn't have a mom and dad. Her uncle Mordecai is like her adopted parent. And Esther has a lot of respect for Mordecai. That becomes clear because when she gets taken away, Mordecai is like, hey, don't tell anyone you're Jewish. We don't know why. The story doesn't tell us that. He just says, keep that secret, and Esther does. Esther goes to the palace, and she finds favor with everyone. Everyone seems to be wrapped with this girl. And then she pleases King Xerxes the best. So she becomes Queen Esther. I mean, this moment's really influential because it puts her in a position to be the hero of our story and do God's will, which all happened due to the way that she pleased King Xerxes. That was a big factor. We can't hide that. Her adult cuddle with King Xerxes was really good. And that's what led to her becoming queen. That was part of the factor. It also makes the whole Queen Vashti situation unclear. Was that right or wrong? I mean, was it right or wrong what happened to her? Because it leads to the opportunity for Esther to be this hero in the story. So the answer is not clear about these things, and it's not clear throughout the story, if we're honest. There's already a lot of moral ambiguity you're probably already picking up, if we're being honest. If we're reading between the lines a little bit. Then we learn about Mordecai at the king's gate, which we often just read over, but we need to realize this wasn't like a gate. It was a large building. This is where all the administrative stuff would happen for the palace. This is where the palace would issue out their judgments and that kind of thing. So it was like a really special place to be. Not anyone could hang out there. Like I couldn't just go up and knock on the door. So this kind of shows us Mordecai's got some power. We don't know how, but he must be a person of some kind of influence. And he uses this position at the king's gate to really still reach out to Esther, to still help her and give her some instructions. And at the king's gate, a couple of years after Esther becomes queen, Mordecai uncovers a plan to kill King Xerxes. And he tells Esther. And then King Xerxes investigates. He discovers it to be true, does what kings do when people betray them, which usually isn't good for the people who get caught. And then he forgets to honor Mordecai, and our chapter ends. And then we get to chapter 3. And we get introduced to a guy named Haman the Agagite, or Amalekite. And he gets power. If you don't know, Amalekites were kind of like ancient enemies of God's people. And Agagite's a term used to refer to that. So this would have brought connections for Israelites when they were reading it, because they would have knew the history of King Saul. This would have been a connection straight away. And we kind of get shown throughout this story that Haman doesn't really deserve this position. He's really good at political smarts, but he might not be a really good person on the inside. This is kind of what we uncover. He's a bit shady. So this leads to Haman getting disrespected by Mordecai. Because Mordecai continually doesn't kneel or pay honor to him. And if you read the story, it's even after royal officials kind of like nudge him and they're like, yo, dude, just bring it in line. Like, come on. But Mordecai won't. He just has no respect for Haman. We never find out completely why. But this lack of public sign from Mordecai that he doesn't respect Haman leads to Haman's plot to kill all the Jews. And I mean all. If you read the story, it's not just, hey, we're going to get the adults. It's women, children, young and old, anyone who is Jewish, that their punishment is to die. And the way he comes up with it is even diabolical. He rolls dice to pick the date of when it's going to happen. And then he goes to see King Xerxes to try to get this all to take place. And King Xerxes gives Haman his signet ring to make the decree against the Jews. And it's interesting, too, because we find out Haman didn't even need his bribe that he prepared for King Xerxes to convince him. This king seems to be easily convinced to conduct a mass genocide on a group of individuals with an appointed time and date, which is a bit odd for Persian empires because they do conquer lots of people, but once they conquer you, they would try to give you some freedom so there wasn't an uprising. Now, they were a bit different about it than the Romans. And it's really interesting what happens after this decree. So this decree leads to bewilderment overcoming the city of Susa. And I want to read that to you guys now, and this is what we read. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's province with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. And the couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. I think it's funny that the king and Haman just sit down and have a drink, but you have this whole city bewildered. I don't know about anyone else, but I feel a bit like overcome by bewilderment just getting in and doing a quick fly through of those 3 chapters and seeing some of the stuff that happens. Because there's a lot of moral ambiguity already in the first 3 chapters, and it doesn't stop throughout the book. There's already been a lot of drinking. There's been a lot of adult cuddles. There's been broken Torah commands. There's Esther hiding her identity, and we don't know why. Because she hides it before this decree gets made. Which makes me wonder, have you ever had a moment where black and white thinking doesn't work, leaving you overcome by bewilderment? Now, I know I have had moments like this before in my life, and I can remember one that happened at the age of 19. A kid, I still call 19 kid. I'm 32, or almost 32 now, so I guess I can say 19's a kid, but I still see it as a kid. My brain wasn't developed. But I still remember the choice I had where there was so much moral ambiguity, it was hard to know what was right and wrong. And the whole moment that led to it was Kim and I were expecting. We weren't married yet. She decides to come to Australia for a visit, ends up being a move. All this stuff happens. Eventually, I get an offer from her parents saying, "Hey, Matt, we want to offer you Kim's hand now. But you need to come over here in like 2 weeks just with the timing and, just stuff like that. What do you think?" So I tell my dad. Dad's funny. He's been helping me this whole time. He goes, "Matt, don't go." He says, "Wait. I'll take you over there when the kid's born. I promise. And I will make sure you and you and Kim get time away to talk about what you want to do. Just don't rush it. Please, just wait." So I have these 2 offers. It's hard to pinpoint the right and wrong in them because they both have elements. Love my dad's offer. But then there's some wrong to it because am I abandoning Kim to go through this all by herself? How would it feel for Kim to find out that I'm not coming? What damage would that cause? Yeah, I can see the right of waiting and going slower and having my dad by my side and making sure me and Kim can really have time to process, but what about these wrongs? It's too hard to sit clear. And then with Kim's parents, the right is, yes, I get a chance to do the family thing with Kim. I get a chance to marry the girl that I've loved since I was 16. I know, I probably loved you at 15, but you didn't know me yet. We got there, though. We got there. But the girl I loved for a while, there's lots of right in that. But there's wrong in that. Where was that offer months ago? What about all the stuff and all the damage that's been said that now it's just gone? What do I do with that? Now I'm supposed to leave everything I know? I'm a 19-year-old kid. At that point, I have my parents paying for my uni. Now, in the States, that's a big deal, but I'm studying to be a nurse. And I'm not just, doing all right at it. I'm actually good. Now, what do you do in that situation? Because in moments like that, black and white thinking doesn't work. And I'm sure we've all had different moments like that if we're honest. And I think in these moments, we must remember what the story of Esther shows us. And that is the realization that God is with his people operating in the gray. So when black and white thinking fails, God's still there. We see it throughout this story already. God operating in the gray with Esther and Mordecai. Regardless of the moral ambiguity that we're picking up, God's still moving. God's still keeping his promise. And I think this is important for us to acknowledge as mature Christians. Because simple black and white thinking doesn't work for this book. I'd even go as far to say that simple black and white thinking doesn't work for life either. Which I think is powerful because it shows us no matter what is going on around us or the situations we are facing, which sometimes are full of complexity, God is with us when black and white thinking doesn't work, operating in the gray. We're not abandoned. Because I think it's God knows that everything is not simply black and white. He knows there's a bit of gray. And he's with us in those spaces. He's with us to operate in those spaces. You know, I can say now me and Kim have been married 12 years, yeah? 12? Yeah, going on 13, 12, got it. Caleb's 12, so 12 years, yeah. So yeah, there's lots of right there, right? But there's still wrongs with that. You try getting married at 19 when you're a kid. Man, we had some stuff to work through, and we still do, if I'm being honest. We're still getting better. So there's right and wrong with that decision. There was right and wrong with how that decision even played out, with how some people did stuff. It wasn't that simple. Even when I look back home, I still have family I'm not that close to because of what I did. And some of that's on me. I can honestly say that. You know, for so long, I didn't have a dad to talk to. Our relationship just got restored probably a couple years ago, if that. So sometimes life's a little bit more complex. Simple black and white thinking doesn't work. And there's a lot of gray that might be in our lives, and God operates in that space. Because I know throughout all these moments, God is with me, and he still is, while I navigate them. Who knows where they'll end up, but I know no matter what, God's operating. He's not leaving me. He's not mad at me like I chose the right or wrong thing, because he knows it's not that simple sometimes. I wouldn't go back and change anything that I chose. But I find the story of Esther helps become a shining star for me that shows me it's okay. It's okay when life's complex and there's not a simple answer. To sit with God and realize God operates in the gray and take that leap of faith. Because we see that throughout this book. And the way our world's going, the world needs a group of Christians that realize everything's not simply black and white. I wish it was. It'd make life a lot easier. I'll tell you right now, so much easier if it was just so simple, but it's not. It's complex. As Christians, we need to acknowledge that. As followers of Christ, we need to be okay with that, and we need to realize that God's still with us operating in the gray. So I'm just going to close in prayer, and then the worship team's going to come back up. If anyone wants prayer, me and Carol will be standing over there, but let's close in prayer. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for your love, for your grace. I thank you that when life isn't simple, when there's complexity and it's hard to know what's right and wrong in those complex situations, that you're with us, that you don't abandon us, that you don't walk away, that you're there by our side operating in the gray. And I thank you so much for that. I thank you for the times that you've done it in my life and anyone else's life that's here. The times that you stood in the gray with us, that you helped us navigate it, that you wrapped us up in your love. And I pray that the times that we'll forget it, you'll help stories like Esther be a shining star for us to look back on. In your amazing name, amen.